So, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to listen to our presentation today. My name is Doran Ritchie. I work with the Saugeen Ojibway Nation Environment Office. My colleague.
I'm Buell. I am working on my PhD at Trent University. So a lot of this work we're going to talk about today is associated with that work. I also have a small consulting firm called Qualitative that does this type of work as well.
As you can see, the presentation title today is using Indigenous knowledge, Western and knowledge systems as tools for informed decision making. A bit of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a bit more background as to why, consulting and informed consent with First Nation actually exists. So I'm going to distinguish the difference between rights holders versus stakeholders. So let me ask a question. I just want to see a show of hands. How many have worked with First Nations for 10 years or more? Okay, so look at that. There's a very small room, so 10 years or less. So the majority of the crowd here today is worked with First Nations for 10 years or less. What I'm hoping to achieve today is I'm going to give a bit of background on kind of the history of First Nations as it relates to Saugeen Ojibway Nation, our territory, and then kind of lead up to present day. I'm going to talk about what treaties mean. I'm going to talk about pre-contact on the land and what rights actually have evolved to, and then touch a little bit about the duty to consult. I think we've beat that conversation to death, quite literally, and now we're evolving to free, prior, and informed consent. So I want to kind of shed a bit of light on what that actually means for Saugeen Ojibway Nation. This is not, keep in mind, this is a conference held by our nation. This is our interpretation, and our goal over the conference is to inform everybody a little bit more on what that looks like, to broaden those horizons, to get a better understanding. So that's going to be my role, and Mary Claire is going to talk about the technical aspects of what we've done through a project in the city of Lone Sound. A lot of really neat information out there. This has hit the media quite a bit in the last couple days, and so we're going to talk a bit about the partnership and how you can actually use the two knowledge systems, Western science and Indigenous knowledge, to achieve informed decision making. So, having said that, I'll let Mary Claire turn it over, and we're gonna take a few minutes to introduce ourselves.
Sorry, Doran. There's a lot of people being shipped over, and I just want to give them a chance to.
How many people are out there? We can try and.
There's a few empty seats here and some wall space.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. My packets.
Talking about your salty dinner?
Last night.
Another chair.
You've got the most space. You've got the most space in this one.
Do you want to see?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I'm not even going to be in there.
There's one more seat right at the front here.
Okay.
There's another seat back here.
There's more seats in here. Good? Yeah, two more.
So we definitely wanted to introduce ourselves. I feel like my journey has influenced how I do what I do and the relationships that I build with different people. I grew up in Peterborough, Ontario, so that's Williams Treaty Territory, and worked for the MNRF for about 9 years seasonally, first as an Ontario Ranger, then as a forest firefighter, and then I became the management biologist for Wawa District, so that's up by the Superior area, if anyone's from that region. It's so beautiful. And that was sort of my first introduction. I mean, I grew up in a system that didn't talk about our relationship as colonial people with the Indigenous nations on this land, and that's just starting to be talked about now in school. So my first experiences then were up in Wawa, or actually fighting fire as well, but mostly as a role as someone, a steward of the Crown, consulting with Indigenous communities over water management planning, forest management planning, pits and quarries, things like that. And it was really interesting, and I'm going to tell a really short story. I was on a forest management plan, and I, as a biologist, we have these buffer zones around trees that have eagle nests in them. And we say, oh, you can't cut within 50 kilometers of that tree. And so we had this community consultation day where we were presenting to forest management science to community members of one of the First Nations in that region. And one of the community members came up to me and he's like, why do you have that circle around that spot on the map? And I said, oh, it's a buffer zone for a raptor nest or an eagle's nest. And he said to me, he was like, well, if you want more eagles, just put in more dumps. There's tons of eagles at dumps. And it really shifted my perspective on why are we doing this? And who are we doing this for? And what is the point of this? And I went back to school eventually after that. I did my master's in the Northwest Territories, with Trent University on water issues in the Northwest Territories. And while I was doing that, I worked for the Trent Aboriginal Cultural Knowledge and Science Program, so working with school of art, people in the Williams Treaty area, mostly their youth, around bringing Indigenous knowledge and science tools together to learn about who we are as human beings, people who depend on the land. And that work ended up filtering into my PhD work, which I'm doing right now. Instead of working with youth, though, I get to work with Doran. Little connection. I'm mostly focused on pollution and water and bringing together our understanding of water and pollution, both as a scientist, but me as a scientist learning about other ways of thinking about that and hoping to inform how we make decisions about what to do about environmental problems in this context of contaminated harbor. So that's a little bit about me. I'll be happy to meet anyone and talk more about that journey after this talk.
So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Saugeen First Nation. Interesting kind of, my life was interesting. I was born and raised in the church. I was not actually allowed to kind of accept and hear my own culture. But that's just the way it was, you know. This ties into the residential schools and all this other stuff. So I had an interesting life because as an Indigenous person, those things are always alive to me. Every time I heard the drum, you know, my heart would race. I'd feel every hair on my body stand up. And things would occur throughout my life, and I knew that was kind of something that existed. So something that couldn't be taken away from me. You know, I was told my whole life not to believe in that kind of way. And the reason I got into this kind of work is because my grandfather, he told me a lot of stories when he was a kid, how he was taken to the residential schools, and eventually how that evolved into his life. You know, he hit the bottle pretty hard for many years. He took my grandma out of residential schools and married her, and they had a lot of problems after that. And the thing that bothered me the most is that, you know, as an Indigenous person, you know, as a Anishinaabe, he practiced his rights all the time. Like, he went hunting, he went fishing, he trapped, he lived on the land, and at every opportunity that the government had, they were constantly harassing him, taking his guns, taking his nets, kind of intruding on his way of life, although he had that right to do so. So as a kid, that was stayed in my head, and I wanted to change that, and I actually specifically wanted to be a conservation officer, because I wanted to focus in that area of law, to bridge those gaps, understand kind of the rights, but also understand the law. I worked with the federal government for a number of years. I did some background, I did some education in environmental sciences and natural resources law. The opportunity came to me when I was working with the Ministry of Natural Resources to become a conservation officer. Unfortunately, that position came in a very negative way. There was a lot of what they call the fishing wars in our territory. And I was the only Native guy in that cluster of people competing for a job. And they wanted to fast track me. So in short term, they wanted to basically use an Indian to fight their Indian war. And that was kind of the opposition that I was dealing with. And so I had to make I planned my whole life on being a conservation officer and bridging those gaps. But then they wanted me to go out and charge my own First Nations people that had their own rights, and not only that, a court-proven right. So that only happened less than 10 years ago. So we're still dealing with a lot of these issues, and that's what kind of motivated me. So I left the Ministry of Natural Resources, thankfully enough, to come to work for my own traditional territory, the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. When I started, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting myself into. I had no idea I was going to walk into the industry, the politics, the science, the argument for the rights. You know, it's been a tremendous learning opportunity for me. It's been very satisfying, and I can assure everybody in this room that, you know, working for Indigenous communities, there are going to be a lot of challenges. It's very tough. I've seen our organization up and down many times in the last 7 years. But the overall experience that's been, I've seen our nation grow. You know, we're learning the concept of sovereignty. We're asserting our rights. We're demonstrating what you know, jurisdiction actually means. I could speak to you all day on just the good things that we're doing. And that's kind of why we're here today, is to talk about that. So, you know, this is my passion. This is kind of what I love to do. And we'll get right into that.
So we just have this as a quick slide. We're all here because of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. One step further is how Canada is incorporating that into their environmental policy, because we're both sort of working in the environmental sector, is Bill C-69 that's coming down the pipeline right now. And everyone's talking about how do we rebuild this relationship, how do we make sure that, you know, their Indigenous people are included in these processes. And I think our approach is not so much about just including, and we're going to talk about that, but rebuilding the processes in a nation-to-nation way. Because a lot of what's coming out of this declaration might be moving still in the direction that's fitting Indigenous people into these colonial frameworks. But before we can even talk about any of that, nation to nation means we need to understand the concept of sovereignty. And so Doran's going to take us through some of where SON stands in terms of what sovereignty is and what that means for this sector. I'm just going to stay right here.
There's an interesting word there, the word sovereignty, and just over lunch, I know what it means, I guess, not in terms of the translation of the definition of sovereignty, because, and I quote, the definition of sovereignty is supreme power of authority. I don't really understand what that actually means, because as a Anishinaabe person, I am responsible for the land. I am part of the land. I am the land. And that responsibility is mine as an Anishinaabe person. And I've also asked a question to a lot of my elders in the last couple of weeks is, let's talk about sovereignty. What does this actually mean? You know, there are many acts of sovereignty. You know, we got political people, we got experts, you know, we got Indigenous knowledge holders, we've got chief and council. Everybody is doing an act of sovereignty. And these are all important because there's no one way to be sovereign. It's a collective, you know, initiative of many different people doing a lot of different things. You know, legal has its place. Our chief and council, our technical staff have its place. The community members, that's who we do it for. That's the mandate that we have, is we do the work for the people that don't know what's actually happening in the territory, that don't know, that don't have that voice. We're that voice. And the question to me, I was pondering this the past week, is, are we actually born into sovereignty? Or is it the acts of the things that we do that make us sovereign as a nation? I'm talking about Canada, I'm talking about everybody in this room. And I heard it two different ways. I heard the answer saying that, well, no, it's not the acts that we do because we're born sovereign. And then I also heard it's also the acts. So the way I've kind of fused this together is the way I understand it, is that as an Indigenous person, you know, the first peoples that walked this land, you know, we were born sovereign because we had that relation, that connection with the land. You know, it was circular. We understood that, you know, when we were born, we live and we follow that full circle. And we learn many different things throughout the course of our life. And then when we pass away, we go back into the land. So that's that connection with the land. You're one with the land. You know, I don't see, at one point in time, there was no distinction between that. But present day, you know, that sovereignty is taken as soon as you get a card that says, here's your status card. This is your social insurance number. that sovereignty, that concept of sovereignty is lost right at that point. You know, so we were born, as an Indigenous people, we were born sovereign. And then as soon as we consent to having or accepting that card, that sovereignty goes away. And then we learn the assimilated world. We go to school, we learn about math and science and all this other stuff. We live in the society that we do now. We live in towns and cities. Very little room for that opportunity to understand who it is with that relationship with the land. I'm 34 years old, and you know what? I didn't actually start coming back to who I was originally meant to be until I was about 18 years old. It took me that long to find myself and come back again. And I'm nowhere near perfect. You know, our elder spoke this afternoon about where am I at? Am I at high school? Am I at college? You know, I feel like I'm still in daycare, the things that I'm learning. You know, because compared to him, he feels like he's only learned this much. And I'm, you know, I'm 34 years old and I feel like I've learned this much. And so I've got a long way to go still from getting back to that point. I was born into sovereignty, but now I've been trying to fight my way back. But I also picked up a lot of tools to understand how the acts of sovereignty can be achieved in the present day. What I've learned over the course of my life is I understood those laws. I understood what the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act means. I understood what the Anishinaabe law means. You know, that Ogitchda knocking the Gaywin, the law of the land. I understand both those. I spent a lot of time working with the federal government and the provincial government, so I learned their language. I understood what their principles are, what their mandates are. But I also was able to see a lot of those values were placed for a modern Western civilization with no room for Indigenous knowledge. And then I come and work for my own nation, and that's what we're all about, talking about Indigenous knowledge. What does it actually mean? We challenge ourselves all the time as what does that actually mean? What does sovereignty mean? You know, what does jurisdiction actually look like? You have to come to the table knowing the language of the people that you're sitting across from. You have to know how to speak the language of environmental assessment, science, policy, economics, all these different languages. But what makes First Nations people very strong is when they know their own culture, when they know their language, when they can actually come to a table and say, yes, we understand what you're saying, but you're missing these components. We're not here to stop a project. We're not here to oppose anything, but it's not good enough. And if we're not satisfied, this project will not stand because we can't let this happen in our territory anymore. So it's about informed consent. That means going through a very rigorous process. We can give you lots of examples. I know some of my colleagues are in here. We talk about pits and quarries. What we're going to talk about here is a very specific project in the Owen Sound Harbor. I'm trying not to digress away from that conversation, but I'm trying to give that context to everybody in this room about what sovereignty actually means and what it means as First Nations organizations to get to that level, to have this conversation. And I want to go a little bit to the pre-contact period. So as far as I know, obviously, and these are stories that have been passed down from a lot of generations, is that there was a time and place where when you lived on the land, you know, at the same time the pyramids that were being built, you know, I have evidence over in one of the provincial parks in the territory that there was a guy sitting there whittling away at a piece of chert, making a point to hunt with. And it's fascinating because how simple the techniques were in comparison to the Egyptian civilization. They were building pyramids where we were still making stone tools and living very small structures with a very small footprint on the land. And a lot of the artifacts now, you don't see these big ruins. Like in Europe, you see, you know, ancient Rome, you see the pyramids still there. Those are big footprint changes. If you go into the territory, I can show you, can put you right on top of an archaeology site, you'll never know people existed there. It was that unique relationship with the land that was valuable. You know, they didn't take too much. It was a very hard lifestyle. We're woodland people, so we deal with the climates that we have in this area. People moved around this territory for many reasons. There were resources there was stone material, there was iron pyrite, there was fresh water, there was fish, there was game, there was medicines. All those are of the land, and that's how we function. And that was a very hard time living like that. I believe the average death rate in a community was about 4 or 5 people every 2 or 3 months. That's a staggering number. That just points to a very hard lifestyle. You know, if you didn't collect enough wood, if you didn't have enough medicine, if you didn't have enough food, or the winter was longer than you expected, there was a lot of death in those communities at those times. So pre-contact, very harsh lifestyle, but the relationship with the land was very intact. And then we move fast forward to the treaties, because I'm running out of time here, I'm keeping track. What happened with the treaties is that I want to point to a fight. The stories that I was told is that our ancestors allowed let the settlers come. Let them come. There was never any opposition. Let them come. And so they came, and there was a bit of peace there for a little while. And then there was a lot of people. And then there was a concept of treaties. Well, we can't protect you on your own lands, so what we can do is make you sign this paper, and you have to give up all this land. We'll give you whatever, we'll give you money. And none of those ever were followed through on. So right from the start we argued, fine, if we have to forcibly surrender our land, we want our right to maintain who we are. And that was an interesting thing, because the people that signed those treaties must have known present day, you know, how much more it would be a fight, but we need to leave something behind, and we're going to leave these rights behind. We're going to leave the indigenous people of our territory the right to harvest, the right to access their land, the right to practice their beliefs. And that triggers a whole lot of discussion, because when we fast forward to those treaties into rights now, modern day, we talk about rights. Can somebody tell me what a right actually is? Anyway.
Well, just rather than just answer that question, it's the rights stem from the land, and they're only recognized by the treaty. So your rights are your obligations, your way you live, the way you processed everything before the treaty.
Right.
Those are your rights.
Is the way of life. You know, and that's what we talk about, and the only word for that right now, the English translation, is a right. So there's a distinction between rights and interests. We talk about that largely in the context of the law, but I want to make the distinction between rights holders versus stakeholders. I hope I gave a brief background on why there's a necessity and there's an obligation under the law to consult with First Nation, because those rights exist. And you know, I say that because we're very fortunate at the Saugeen Environment Office that we actually have a technical body that can advise our leadership on the things that, you know, could infringe our rights. We're evolving every single day. We're light years ahead when we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's all been progressive. All the work that's happened has led us up to this point. And, you know, that's what we're focused on, is like, what is actually our right? That means I have to look at my clan species, I have to look at the air, I have to look at the water, I have to take all these things into consideration, and we actually have to re-evaluate the process to joint decision making. And we have to use Western science. We actually have to use that, because that's the validation under the law. But for Indigenous people, it's the law of the land. That's our rights, that's our law. And so that's what I want to talk a bit about today, is how we've evolved from consultation and accommodation to evolving to this concept of free, prior, informed consent. We have to work with both knowledge systems, Western science, Indigenous knowledge. So I think I'll stop for now.
Do you want to
And I'm
trade
going to let
spots?
them see if they care.
So that sort of gets into where we're going with our case study, is achieving rights, achieving sovereignty by working with the different tools that are available to us, and moving away from just fitting Indigenous knowledge and their, you know, achieving their rights within these colonial structures, but to rebuild them in a way that addresses everybody's needs at the table. We're all sharing this land and we're certainly all human beings. So how do we achieve that then? I'll go to the next slide then. So here I just pulled some different images of federal frameworks. These two come from the environmental impact assessment process that's proposed by the Trudeau government. This one is one that we've been working with quite closely. It's all blurry there, but the words aren't as important. It's more about the structure and the lines and the hierarchy and the systems that are based off of our Western knowledge system, which has been really handy. I mean, that's what brings us the iPhone and the projector we're using today. So this one in particular I'm going to talk about in a bit. If you go to the next slide. This is the federal proposed new environmental impact assessment process. It's got a lot of content in here, and they're moving in a direction. So this is, you know, employing the UNDRIP policies or recommendations. And so you have almost within every section these nice little groupings of let's consult Indigenous people, let's include them in our plans, let's include them in some of our decision making. But what about all the other clusters that are on there? Shouldn't it be, if this is a nation-to-nation experience, if this is building decision making together, then why are we separating so often on when we're coming up with new information or conclusions? So is there a way to better make this as building it together? And maybe this is too complicated to make it that way. Maybe it could be wishful thinking, but there is a way that we found in terms of understanding the risk assessment process, and we're going to use that process with regards to pollution, on how to sort of rebuild it and actually bring a new framework together. No, we don't really like calling it a framework, but bringing a new system together to then make decisions about what should happen next. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is that one framework. This is the risk assessment framework for the Great Lakes. It's used, Hamilton Harbor, incredibly contaminated. They sort of use this process to address what are the issues, how do we make decisions around these issues of pollution specifically. Right at the beginning of this system, there's going to be a divergence depending on what cultural background you have or what worldview you come from. So if you click for a second. For example, this process says the first step to figuring out how you're going to assess risk is to identify critical receptors, define ecosystem quality, and then identify potential stressors in that system. So things that might also influence your decision making. These are all based, so if you use the green sphere to represent a colonial worldview, so the worldview that I grew up in and how I was trained in as a scientist, how we determine what a critical receptor is then based on our economy, so it doesn't make us money, or is it legislatively identified as important, like a species at risk or something like that. For ecosystem quality, we have these beautiful benchmarks that tell us if you have this much mercury in the water, it's safe, and if you have this much, it's polluted. That's these guidelines that tell us whether it's good or not. So I'm not going to explain every sphere because we're going to run out of time. But if it was, say, and these next spheres, if you click, are based off of different experiences I've had with different community members and knowledge holders from Indigenous communities talking about how they might define some of these things. So for example, ecosystem quality isn't about benchmarks, it's about thinking in terms of 7 generations and our relationship with the land and sustainability. That should be how we define what we see as an ecosystem quality. Or, for example, critical receptors. We're not looking at economy, or sometimes we're looking at economy for sure, but species of cultural significance, maybe things for medicine or subsistence living, these can be really important factors that need to be included in the system. So we have these two worldviews, and we have them overlapping because as human beings, we all have a relationship with the land in some capacity, and so sometimes our values are going to overlap, but often we're going to have a divergence. We're not going to meet each other's needs if we just bring one view to the table and try to fit another view in, or ignore the other view in general. So the other issue with this slide is we still have a colonial framework. Even if we try to include all these things, we're still following a process that is boxed into one worldview. This didn't come from an Indigenous community. This didn't come from an elder or from the land. This came from the Western science system. So we need to think about then if we're going to actually truly have a nation-to-nation decision-making process over the risk of pollution in this case, we need to rebuild how we tackle it, including all these fears, but build it together to have a new system that addresses our needs. If you want to go to the next. So, Doran, do you want to talk a little bit about Owen Sound Harbor?
Yeah.
This is getting into the case study of how we did this now.
Sorry, I did something.
Uh-oh. I can get it going again if you want to.
I really know how to use my phone. So the Owen Sound Harbor, I'm not going to go into the history on that, but I will tell you kind of the present issues right now. The harbor that we found, it was very contaminated, and the Transport Canada is trying to divest the harbors across Canada. So in that divestiture process, there was two triggers. Well, there's a few. There was the right to the fishery. There is the potential land transfer of lands underclaimed by Saugeen, and more recently the contaminant issue that we found out in 2010. So in that period of almost 20 years, we've been fighting, and we talk about the delay from First Nations in decision making or process. Saugeen's been waiting 20 years for some kind of answer from the federal government on what is going to happen. And what I want to point out is we've had to go above and beyond. You know, there is an automatic legal trigger for consultation on transfer of lands under claim, and now that we know there is a severe contaminant issue, there's another trigger. Yet, in the present day, we still don't have a consultation process, and we've had to reach out to people like Trent University and Mary Claire to help us inform those decisions based on what's been signed, and also use the knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge system to kind of get to where we are today. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah. And because I was playing with the computer, I don't know if Doran mentioned, right now with the Transport Canada's concept of what should happen is based off of a risk assessment that would have followed a similar process to that framework that we showed before. So with this project, we came to new conclusions based on rebuilding that framework in a way that meets the needs of Saugeen, but also hits all the boxes that the federal government requires of any consulting firm or risk assessors out there. So we know that we have to meet both sides of the table so that we can all understand where the decision is coming from, or appreciate where the decision is coming from. Yeah, thanks. So here we have a blank, now it's not blank, that's okay, we can work with this. So I'm just going to quickly power through. You might have to press X on that box because that keeps coming up. Yeah. Power through the process, and if anyone wants to talk more about this, Doran and I, or I can chat with you later. There's going to be a lot of text as we fill this sphere with information.
We've got time.
We have time? Okay. So the first thing that happened then is we had Saugeen realize that they wanted to bring in a scientific expert to tackle this issue. That maybe some science, Western knowledge tools would support in their decision making or what was going on.
Can I just emphasize on one thing before we get into that? So, like I said, we've been involved in this process for 20 years now, almost, and in that time, our message has never changed. It's like we need a seat at the table to understand what the divestiture means and how Saugeen becomes a part of that because of the legal triggers that exist. That's the commercial fishing rate and the transfer of land that is under claim. So, despite those two major triggers for consultation, the federal crown, even present day, still resists all attempts for consultation, a meaningful process. So this is not a past issue, this is a very current day issue. And we've done a substantial amount of work to get to this point. So I think that's a really important point to emphasize, is that in 2018, we are still even fighting for a seat at the table to have a joint decision-making process on lands that are, on projects that are gonna have a significant impact both on our fishery and potentially to human health as well.
So with what Doran's saying, we partnered together. We found community experts, which was a lot of from the team that Saugeen brings to the table, as well as myself, a faculty at Trent, and we tried to figure out what was our plan to tackle this issue. How do we understand the contaminants? How does this play into consultation and the project at hand in this 20-year history together? Well, we ended up finding, yeah, you can click it, where these were some of the key components questions that we were asking at this stage in the game. What activities being, so species and people are at risk, like who are we concerned about? And then from a broader scale, what are the community concerns? What are they thinking about right now? Why is this an issue for Saugeen? And then who has knowledge and expertise on this area of concern? And what tools are out there to try to help answer these questions from a scientific tool basis? So we're looking at filling our pockets or our tool belt with as much different resources as possible to answer this question. So bringing together community knowledge experts, scientific experts, and all the tools in between to make that happen. You can click it. So that's sort of the outer phase, and it definitely influenced everything that we did, and we go in and out of these circles as they unfold. So you can click again. The next component was, we call it selecting lines of evidence, is kind of a really sciencey term, I guess. Essentially selecting pieces of information that are going to be the most useful, or the pieces of information that are going to help us answer our question. What should we focus our work on? Because we can't do everything. You can click it. And so at that point, we ended up bringing in a few more community experts and talking about other tools that we hadn't really talked about in that first sort of round of understanding what was going on. And so these are some of the main things that we came up with then, is we want the information to all be based in either science or community knowledge or both. And we need to make sure that we, both the Saugeen experts, community experts, and scientists, have an understanding of our relationship with where the area we're working with. That means that we're doing everything together. And I think a few people in presentations have talked about this, doing things together, not just bringing in outside experts to answer certain questions and then them leaving. It's about collecting all the information together. We're on the boats together, we're in the lab together, we're in community workshops together, we're going to chief and council together. We're learning. As we learn, we're collecting knowledge and information as a team and sharing in that experience. What that means is when we go to make decisions or influence decisions, we have each other's perspectives present at the table in our minds, and that can influence things in a positive way. And again, we brought in more knowledge holders and scientists when we felt like we needed to seek out other people who had information on this topic. Yeah.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah.
Just a quick comment.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to where you had all the circles and they're starting to overlap,
Yeah.
the only caution is how do you have half of belief? Because what those two circles show is that, okay, we're going to take some of that belief and add it to ours to make that concept. So it's just a statement or a comment, but how do you have half a belief when it comes to looking after the land or rights or any of that thing?
I can add to that. So the reason for that is to go to the communities, and our practice was to say, okay, here's what we know from a technical perspective. Here's what we know from a pollution, fish, and water quality perspective as it relates to the Western knowledge. What we're missing, though, is the community expert knowledge on what they know, how they use it, when they use it, why they use it. And so that was kind of the addition to that knowledge gap, is to say, this is what we know, here's what we still don't know. And beyond that, what else don't we know beyond that? And so what we're trying to achieve is that measure of synergy so that we're collecting all the information to bring all that back to an informed decision-making process to say, what is the status of the harbor moving forward?
And I feel like we can come back to that too if it didn't answer your question. So we're sort of in the throes now of the project. This is a 4-year project, and it's still kind of ongoing because we're still having discussions about what's next. And really this last sphere was pretty much what Doran got to, is how do we make a decision? We have all this information here. We've gone about it in a very different way than what has usually been done. And we've had so many people involved, so many voices on the table. We're, now it's like, how do we evaluate this information? We don't want the science validating the Indigenous knowledge. We don't want to compromise either knowledge system. We want all this information to act as a foundation for how we make a decision. Because that's, if it can do that, then maybe this decision will address everybody's concerns at the table. So yeah, you can click it. And so that was sort of this next final phase, and then you can click it again. And so some of the, we used a whole bunch of different approaches and discussions. We had meetings with community members, especially fishermen in this circumstance. We're really concerned about lake whitefish and the impacts of the pollution on the fishery. And then you can click it again. And so we came up, this was sort of the outline of the process then, and it was this ongoing experience with each piece, not necessarily standing alone. It was influencing itself. And I think context is really, really important, because this process will not work for every situation. But it is a way to bring in all the scientific tools that you need to check all the boxes with federal policy, but you're doing it in a way that's totally driven by the community and what comes from the community knowledge and the people that are involved. And yeah, you can click again. So we moved away from this and then turned it into something you can, and the colors, these aren't associated with the colors on the other side. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have used the same colors. So this is actually, it filled in a little bit more, and there's so much text and I don't think there's time to go through it, but these are some of the more specific tools we use for this project. So in terms of some of the scientific tools, we did a lot of sampling and related them to federal and provincial guidelines. We did a bunch of lab experiments with the fish that the Saugeen people identified as important cultural and economic species. We did, we even went out on the boats and harvested fish, mills and eggs to raise them in the lab to make sure that we were using the fish, the genetic strain that was important to the community. We had tons of workshops and meetings with community members, fishermen mapping, lots of participatory mapping, but also just meals, shared meals and experiences. And Doran, I don't know if you want to talk to any of the meetings that we had, even with council.
Well, just to add to that, I know we use one fish species, a lab species called Medaka, but just to elaborate a little bit more on how do you strengthen your case. Don't just say you have a right to be consulted. You know, say I have a right because my fisheries are being impacted, and the evidence to support that is we use our own, we used our own fish and raised them, just to prove that there is a substantial impact to our fishery. And these contaminants that exist, whether they're in the water column or disturbed, both will have an adverse impact on our fishery, and here's how, and here's why. So having that community dialogue is so very important, because we got the consent from the community to go ahead and do this kind of work. We had to do it from the community, you know, because if the community mandate said we don't care about the fisheries anymore, I guess I'd be out of a job. And you know, that's where a lot of that information comes from, that historical knowledge. You know, we had the consent, we had the buy-in from the fishermen to say yes, I know the spawning shoals, I know how to do this. Come with us, we'll get these fish and we'll donate them and we'll use them for this purpose. It's for the protection of the rights, and that's why you see this very elaborate, you know, we talked about lake whitefish. What kind of activities do we do in that area? Swimming, boating, fishing. What is the health of the water? What is the health of the fish? What does it mean to Saugeen Ojibway Nation? But the bigger overreaching picture, what does it actually mean to the general public? I don't know if you guys have ever been to Onsound, it's just down the road. There's a small city, there's that inner harbor. And there's a lot of access to that inner harbor. And so what we're trying to do is obviously protect the rights, but also because we're a part of this land, this is not just a First Nations issue. You know, but taking this community approach, I think I can feel confident in saying that we've probably captured all the interests, more or less, of the future of this harbor for the people in general. And using that, I mean, this is a very hard line approach. You know, this is evidence that cannot be argued with because it's using science, it's using Indigenous knowledge, it's got the support from the communities, and that's why we've done all the extra work. So when we go to present this information, this would be a fairly hard case to argue that you know we need to be joint decision makers, and that's what this is all about, really.
If I have to press X on that before I move forward. Of course, it was, in our minds, a successful project, but as any collaborative project, especially big project that's around environmental management and decision making, there are challenges associated with it. And one important thing was time. We needed time to answer these questions, and there was a lot of pressure because decisions were being made about the harbor, or they were moving forward to try to make decisions, and we were still doing some of this work. And so time was a really important thing, and it takes time to do this type of work, because oftentimes you're doing twice as much work to do it right. And so you need time, and you need cost. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the cost history of this.
Well, go to the bottom, the bureaucratic hoops. Like I said, since day one, we've known about this project. We actually filed for a Freedom of Information request to obtain this report done by Doran Consulting in 2010. And ever since then, we felt like we were on a time clock. You know, there would be multiple organizations that were willing to take on the harbor, and we had to fight to have a say at the table. And that's been ongoing and ongoing. And so I'm pointing to the issues that still exist. Time, cost, and bureaucracy is always in the way. Today, we still don't have a process. You know, the work that we've done has only been recently completed. But this is the amount of work, and what I want to do is I want to shed some light on, you know, as an Indigenous organization, it's not all easy. We're always learning, evolving very quickly, you know, but it's not always easy to get a seat at the table to have a joint decision-making process. And that comes with a lot of costs. You know, we've had to bear the legal costs to just say there's a legal trigger, there's a legal obligation. We had to engage our community members, we had to engage, you know, other experts in the field that can speak to toxicology. So there's a lot going against First Nations when we're talking about the duty to consult. I've heard from a lot of First Nations that they don't have the capacity. And that is something that I want to focus on as well, is that you know, it is very hard. Like, I think you can appreciate that it's taken 20 years for Saugeen to get here when we've made some major strides on other things. We talked about the land thing. We talked about, you know, the relationship with Bruce Power, all these other different things, the municipal infrastructure projects that are happening all over our territory. But yet we have something like this that is a human health and a fish health concern, where we're still getting a lot of, and almost 100% resistance on this. So I want to just kind of expose a lot of that. You know, capacity is an issue, whether it's people capacity, whether it's financial capacity, whether it's a mandate. You know, a lot of First Nations are inundated with their own community issues, and now they're expected to act as governors across their own nation with little to no capacity. And you've got all this infrastructure happening all at the same time, and all these requests for consultation. It's very hard to keep up on all this stuff. So at Saugeen, we're very fortunate to have a very strong mandate to protect the territory as joint decision makers, you know, as jurisdictional authority in our own traditional territory. But that didn't happen overnight. And, you know, this is one of the projects that I'm going to still say is a relic of the old times, because, you know, if this happened, you know, in the next 5, 10 years, we wouldn't be here still trying to get a seat at the table. It would just be, I fully expect that consultation and informed consent is going to evolve very quickly. In the short amount of time that I've been with Saugeen, I've seen some tremendous strides. And, you know, this is our purpose today, is to try to reach out to the industry, First Nations, developers, legal, and everybody else, to share what we've known and what we've experienced about, you know, informed decision making, and how actually Western science and Indigenous knowledge can coexist to achieve joint decision making. A fairly new concept for me, and I think I've said enough about that, so I'll let you take over.
I think you hit some of this on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding the cost, capacity is always an issue, especially for myself, but I come from the Northwest Territories and it's a very robust system there. So I'm thankful that that system is in place to deal, sometimes it deals with our capacity issues as well, a little bit. But when it comes to the partnership that you had between Saugeen and Trent University, was there a cost on that, and who was burdened with that cost, and how did you get that cost taken care of?
Sure. So one of the advantages of partnering with the university is I become free labor. And so that was a huge bonus when you have a graduate student, so as a PhD student, I come with my own funding. And so the project that I ended up on then, the research, the money to be in the field wasn't there, but the money for my expertise was. So that's a huge part, because you're paying over $1,000 a day to have a consultant go out and do some of this work. So that partnership was key in terms of that cost for experts. Cost for the actual field work though, it was a multi-phase project. So the first phase, the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and Trent split the fieldwork cost, seeing that we both get to benefit from the information generated. The second phase, I don't know if you want to speak to how the second phase of funding came to fruition.
Yeah, I was through an agreement with the city of Salmon. You know, they recognized the relationship that needed to exist. So they came to us actually and talked about, you know, consulting with Saugeen about the many issues. It was a joint venture at the time, and so they were able to provide a bit of funding to kind of continue the research. So, and then of course we had to kick in our own funds, and there are a lot of funds still outstanding. So open up your checkbooks.
Yeah. And I think a big part of sort of tying this back into free, prior, and informed consent is that whole process ensured that when Doran goes to the table to represent his community, that everyone involved in the project was fully informed of how we got to the information we arrived at and the decision we arrived at. And within that process is consultation happening in an informal way, and when you arrive at a final conclusion and you're happy with the final conclusion, there's consent built into that, because it's saying, this is what I'm okay with. I'm consenting to if we go in this direction based on all this information that we've accumulated. So when you rebuild whatever process you're using in partnership to arrive at final conclusions, you're building into that informed decision making and consultation and relationship building, which to me was one of the most valuable parts of this project, were the incredible relationships everyone involved had. So then we began to, we trusted each other, and when an expert needed to say, I really think we should go down this path, it was like, yeah, I trust you, let's go down that path, because we had a relationship and because we were working together. And that also takes time. You can't just call someone up and be like, hey, I wanna do this, and then all of a sudden you're doing a project. You have to build a relationship. We've been working on this for 4 years. And that's a huge part of the process. I think that's the foundation of the process, are the relationships.
And so, just to kind of elaborate a little bit on kind of where we go next step. So, we talked a little bit about the history, kind of validating why we're here, talking about the rights and the evolution of consultation to consent. We work with Western science and Indigenous knowledge to achieve this joint decision-making process. So, you know, our next anticipated steps for this contaminated harbor is that essentially what we're asking is for the process to effectively stop. Because there is a delegation of responsibility for those contaminants. So, you know, it's unfortunate that, you know, the messaging right now for that program, the divestiture program, is to get rid of essentially the liability and put it to somebody else, like Saugeen Ojibway Nation, like the city of Owen Sound, like a private owner. So you're bearing the responsibility of those contaminants at a very low cost, next to nothing. I bet you Transport Canada would sell that harbor for $1. But what you inherit is a lifetime of contaminants. And it poses human health concerns, certainly fisheries health concerns. And this is the kind of information that we need to evolve to use as joint decision making to go to make this decision to say, hey, we understand your science. We're infusing that with our culture. It's a very tight system that can't be ignored anymore.
Perhaps, Doran, you could inform the crowd here of your investigation when the city of Owen Sound, the council was asked to take it over. And when they investigated the price of the cleanup.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, that's probably a good segue to kind of where I'm out of time now, but you know, the reality is, when we knew back in, I think, maybe 2011 or 12, at that time, it was estimated about $50 million to clean up the inner harbor. That's going to have major implications on the economy, the health of the water. I'm no scientist in this regard or engineer, but I would imagine you have to build somewhat of a substantial wall, a cofferdam of some sort, to completely isolate the contaminants if that harbor was ever to be cleaned up. So that's a very, that's a lot of money. And, you know, the federal government has just said, well, yes, we know. Our reports suggest that the harbor cannot be dredged. Not much you can do with it. But we still want to divest it anyways. And so, here, you take all the liability. We give you $50,000 to repair the walls if and when they deteriorate at some point in time. So, and again, just to reiterate, that's a very serious concern, not for just SON, but for the general public. And so we've been forced to kind of take this approach to evolve consultation, you know, to achieve consent. And I hope that answers your question, Barney, about the expenses.
I just wanted the crowd here to kind of know what we're up against. And also the fact that the member of parliament is from Owen Sound, and so is the MPP. And well, the member of parliament is going on party lines, so just get rid of a bad investment. And that's representation we get.
And finally, where it takes us at the end of the day is when we meet back with the federal crown on the new study results. Our question and our answers are not going to be, well, yes, we still want to take the harbor. They've asked us if we wanted to take that. You know, there's going to be a different opportunities for, you know, Transport Canada to say, what this actually brings us to is a place to say, we need to figure out what's happening to this harbor. There's more research. There's more things that need to be studied. There are fish species that live in that inner harbor that never leave that area. We need the tissue sample. We need to understand what the effects of leaving it, the effect of cleaning it up, who's going to own it after that. All those different things need to be at that decision-making table. So through the through the partnership with Trent University and Saugeen, that's what we've achieved, is that point where we're gonna say, okay, now we're at a joint making decision. We've verified our rights, we've used your science, we've also used your culture. Now it's time to sit down at the table and have a serious discussion. Thank you.
I have a question. Oh, do you have a question?
A question, comment. Again, coming from the Northwest Territories, not working directly for First Nations, but I'm an environmental assessor, work for a co-management board that does the environmental impact assessments. In terms of the process that you outlined, have you looked at setting narrative, qualitative objectives that then could be used? So rather than trying to look at things only from sort of a community's perspective and a Western scientific perspective, and trying to find some way of converting and translating that language for the department who's overseeing this project, have you thought about developing clear qualitative objectives that then are just used by people who are setting up aquatics monitoring programs to try and then back calculate? We've had experience with some EAs that Joanne would know that the First Nation said, okay, well, we used to set these quantitative amounts for different contaminants. But going to just a way of life perspective, a holistic point of view of saying, we are going to be impacted if there's a change of taste in water at this location that we traditionally use. As scientists, we could back calculate, figure out how to set discharge criteria, but it's purely driven, not by toxicology, by the impact on the way of life of the people in that particular area. We have lots of examples of that being used in the north.
This has been almost a 20-year process, but I can say in terms of the active involvement, we're just at the start. We identified the information gaps in the Dillon report, but I think that is going to be a very serious discussion with the federal government going forward on setting those criteria and evaluating those risks. And that's kind of the model that we wanted to use, a holistic approach, using Western Indigenous knowledge. I really like that, even just to change the taste of the water can influence and trigger more studies and evaluation.
Yeah.
And also, just one thing to add to that too, that all gets tailored out. There's a process involved with the regulatory aspect, and the first thing is your scoping exercise, right? And so you scope out those issues in a room full of, at the table all together, so that sets the pace going forward in terms of what you have to scope out on those issues, and perhaps set up those monitoring stations, and see if there's, so you can monitor what those issues are, and maybe provide some mitigating measures on that. But that scoping exercise that's in the north there sets the tone going forward for how you alleviate some of those concerns. And I noticed that as part of your framework there, that part is missing. And there's, I guess I could say in terms of this framework, there's a lot of lessons that could be learned, especially from the north, because well, we do have a really unique system there, and we do have land claims that are in the north that, when it comes to the regulatory boards, we build that into our land claim agreement.
I think a big thing, so we talked about sort of these achievable or non-achievable criteria when we sort of evaluated all the information. A big reason why we avoided that in the end, although incredibly useful, is we didn't want to lock Saugeen into saying we're okay with this, because a lot of community members would say, well, we want no pollution. We're not okay with a benchmark or this threshold. We want to be taking care of Mother Earth and the water in the purest of sense. And so we didn't want to lock this project into here is our objective. We wanted the project to inform that we're not okay with the current situation, and now we need to decide how are we going to address that current situation, and what are we going to try to achieve at the table with the federal government. So it was, I think those are incredibly useful. We did talk about it a little bit, but we steered clear because we didn't want there to be a specific set of rules, because the community's needs are always changing, and people's perception within the community are on a sort of a gradient as well.
And so through our scoping exercise too, is you might, as a First Nation, once they scope out the issue and they state what that issue is, and subsequent studies result after that, you know, it might be where the issue that you pointed out through the scoping exercise was a small issue at that time, but through the study it becomes a bigger issue. And so that is a plus, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We found that too, like there are a few things that we dabbled in, and then that like ended up being a huge part of the project.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just really quickly, generally in regards to the prior informed consent, are there lessons that you have taken that you can apply to further development when the next industry comes a knocking, that you can just say, okay, this is part of our new protocol and process?
I don't want to get into that dream now, we can have it, because that's
Well,